Okay, welcome to video number 56 of the Diaries of a Coronavirologist YouTube channel. Today is the 31st of March, and for anyone new around here, I'm Stuart. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow who's been studying coronaviruses since 2016, which makes me a coronavirologist. Just as a quick note on the channel before I dive into tonight's topic, unbeknownst to me, about 2 weeks ago I hit my 1-year anniversary of having the channel. So I never expected to be someone who ran a YouTube channel, and therefore to have had one for about a year with over 50 videos on is somewhat surprising, but quite cool, quite interesting. So thank you to everyone who's watched a video, shared a video, liked a video, commented on a video, whatever it may be. And thank you for anyone who comes back regularly. I appreciate the support and I appreciate you taking the time to watch me talk about coronaviruses. So, speaking of the people who come back to the channel regularly to watch me talk about all things to do with COVID-19, you may have heard me recently in recent videos say I'm trying to stop talking about vaccines and talk about something else or anything else because there's many other interesting topics. However, I kept getting sucked back into talking about vaccines based on what was happening in the news. Well, I've finally decided today to pull myself away from the topic of vaccination against SARS-2 and talk about something different. And as per the title of the video, that involves Neanderthal DNA and COVID-19 risk and protection. So this is something that I found very interesting to read about and research around, and it quite nicely illustrates one of the things I find so fascinating about virology, or the study of viruses, in that they touch so many different aspects of scientific research. So obviously thinking about vaccines and things I've talked about on the channel recently, that touches how to design a vaccine, how the immune system interacts. It looks at what's protective and what's not. In this area, I'm going to be going into things about DNA and genetics and human evolution and human migration out of Africa, but that's all connected with viruses and disease severity. And so this breadth of things that viruses can touch is one of the things I find so fascinating about being a virologist. So the way the video is set up tonight is I'm going to talk a little bit about genetics, DNA, human evolution and human migration out of Africa and how those things can interact. So the ideas of how you can use studying of genetic sequences to track how ancient humans migrated out of Africa. You can think of that in the way that commercial companies like 23andMe or Ancestry.com or those kind of people use your genome sequence to give you an idea of your ancestry. It all ties together. And I want to start the video by talking a little bit about that. Then I'm going to move in to discuss 2 papers that I read recently because I thought they'd be interesting, and they indeed were. The first one I'll cover was published in the journal Nature, and it looks at how Neanderthal DNA in the human genome may be linked to the risk of developing more severe COVID-19. The second paper was one that was published in the journal PNAS, and this one looked at a segment of DNA which again came from Neanderthals, and this one seems to be protective against COVID-19. I actually found that one a little bit more interesting because it went more into why that segment of DNA may be protective. It looked more at what genes are in that segment and goes into some interesting mechanistic details. So I want to spend some time looking at those. Now, I've put links to both of the papers down in the description for this video, and I've also put timestamps down. So if you want to jump around, if you want to skip through things or go to specific things, then hopefully the timestamps can help you navigate through the video. For the stories I'm going to go into tonight, I'm going to have a little bit of assumed knowledge. So I'm going to assume that people are aware of the ideas of humans evolving in Africa and then the migration out of Africa, which led to how Homo sapiens, we, have colonized the whole world. However, we weren't the only hominids that evolved in Africa and migrated out to certain parts of the world. There were others, such as Homo erectus, Neanderthals, Denisovans, but they all went extinct. We were the only ones that survived, we Homo sapiens. However, we all lived at similar times and could have interacted. I'm also going to assume that people are okay with the ideas around evolution and natural selection and how advantageous traits get selected for, and that things like geographical regions that put selective pressures by being colder or having worse hunting terrain or things like that have driven human evolution. An example is hair color or eye pigmentation, how that changed as humans migrated around the world. The final assumption, for something I'm just not going to go into too much detail while I'm going through the video and the topic, is about how DNA is built up from nucleotides. The building blocks of DNA are nucleotides, and these are shorthanded to A, T, C, and G. And that the human genome is made up of chromosomes, and you get one set from the parental side and the other set from the maternal side. So let's focus in on migration. So all that kind of information about the different hominids, the archaic humans that migrated out of Africa, that can all be looked at through fossil records. So, for example, you can look at the bones that are in different parts of the world and you can date them. So you can say at such and such a point, humans arrived in America based on the age of the fossils and the bones that are there. But you can also do a similar kind of analysis through genetics, because it's possible to get DNA from these ancient fossils. So you can look at DNA from very early Homo sapiens in sub-Saharan Africa, and then you can look at the DNA of those that went up into Europe or into Asia, and then you can compare how though the genetic changes, the mutations that occurred in each, appeared in the different regions. And from that you can infer the kind of selective advantages that may have been present in Northern Europe versus sub-Saharan Africa. So you can look through dating and genetics at what kind of differences there were in human populations depending on the difference of genes. And you can also do it in a time span. So you can look at how different populations moved to different areas and how their genetics changed over time because of natural selection and evolution. And you can, of course, extend those ideas out for generation and generation and generation and so on and so forth up to us modern humans. And that's the kind of analysis that the commercial companies like 23andMe use to give you your heritage. You are such and such a region in your heritage based on the historical evolution and the genetic traits that occurred in different regions of the world when the world was far less populous than it is now. And just to give a frame of reference on this kind of time frame that we're talking about here, this is tens to hundreds of thousands of years ago. It's thought that the out of Africa migration time frame was probably around 200,000 years ago, that kind of range. So we're looking at a very long time scale here. So a small thing to keep in mind while thinking about how humans have evolved and adapted throughout this migration process is a great driver of evolution of humans throughout history has actually been infectious disease. So linking things back to coronaviruses, of course, infectious diseases. And that will, of course, come up when I get into these papers. So the final thing I want to point out in this build-up background section is that what's become clear since about 2013, when the first Neanderthal genome was fully sequenced and well sequenced, is that humans and Neanderthals interacted. So the idea is that Neanderthals left Africa earlier than Homo sapiens, and then Homo sapiens followed and met Neanderthals on the way, and that there was some interbreeding between them. So just to give an example of how that kind of analysis is done, let's imagine 100,000 years ago, and you find fossils from that age that are in sub-Saharan Africa, and you take the DNA, and they may have a gene you look at which has the genetic sequence of AAA, just keeping it very basic. In real life, these are much longer stretches of DNA, which I'll recap at the end, but just for simplicity, we'll use AAA. Now, if you also find fossils from 100,000 years ago, the same time frame, in Northern Europe, you may find in this hypothetical world I'm building that there is a mixture of some people, some individuals, based on skeletal remains, that had AAA, but there's also some that have AAC. So at some point, a mutation has happened and there is a new genetic variant present in the Northern European ancient Homo sapiens. With the advent of being able to sequence and analyze and find more and more remains of Neanderthals, it may then become apparent that all of the Neanderthals have AAC. So this strongly suggests that maybe Neanderthals were the source of that AAC variation, and it was through interbreeding of ancient Homo sapiens and Neanderthals that brought the AAC into the Homo sapien population. Then through evolution, through time, extended times, maybe that AAC has a selective advantage. So if you look at fossils at, say, 20,000 years ago from Homo sapiens, they may all have the AAC in Northern Europe. But 20,000 years ago in sub-Saharan Africa or in maybe Southeast Asia, that's all still AAA. It was only a selective advantage in a certain geographical region. However, that Neanderthal DNA provided a selective advantage, and that population of people carry that DNA. So that's kind of a very loose description of how you can kind of get ideas and assess whether there has been intermixing of Neanderthal and Homo sapien DNA. And indeed, through all of that in much more complex and much longer sequences where obviously the more differences that match up, the higher likelihood it's a real combination, not just random chance, it's become apparent that the modern day human, Homo sapiens, we have about somewhere between 1 and 2% of our genome is from Neanderthals. Now these kind of small changes that I use as my example, so AAA to AAC, this is called a single nucleotide polymorphism, to give it its official name. So the nucleotide being the A or the C or the T and the G, which I haven't used in my example for DNA, and it's a single nucleotide that changes. So a single nucleotide polymorphism, or SNP, or a SNP. And these SNPs are the genetic traits that are usually used for this kind of tracking. And that's also the main driver of how commercial companies like 23andMe, who I'll stress aren't sponsoring this video, even though I keep referencing them, that's how they track geographical heritage of you if you choose to do one of their tests. And just for a little bit behind the scenes stuff, I guess, personal stuff, I recently did a 23andMe test, and I apparently have, on average, more Neanderthal DNA than the average 23andMe user, although I'm still only around the 2% mark. So just to give you I also am part of that somewhere between 1 and 2% Neanderthal DNA people. So hopefully that establishes how Neanderthal DNA can make its way into Homo sapiens, and then through evolution up to modern day humans, Homo sapiens, we can still carry some of that Neanderthal DNA. And that now nicely leads me into talking about how that Neanderthal DNA may impact whether or not you develop severe COVID. So the first paper I want to talk about was a paper that was published in the journal Nature last year. Again, as I said at the top of the video, I've got a link to it down in the description. And this paper found a part of DNA that has come from Neanderthals which is associated with severe COVID. So the way this was done is that the authors took genetic genome-wide information from people who were hospitalized with COVID. So the people who developed the most severe COVID-19. So it was around 3,000 people, a little bit over 3,000 that they looked at. And they compared the genome information from those people with genome information for, I guess, what could be loosely called a representative human. So this is the 1,000 Genomes Project. I won't go into too much detail about that. If you want to look it up on Google, it's a really interesting initiative. And it basically takes 1,000 plus it's gone bigger than 1,000, but thousands of genomes from different geographical regions, and uses that as a reference so that you could compare a typical human with a population of humans who get hospitalized by COVID, for example. The idea then is to work out if there are any major differences between your hospitalized people and your reference human. If you see that there's certain DNA regions, certain genes that are much more common in the people who are hospitalized, that suggests that that is important, is linked to, or is a driver of COVID severity. And conversely, if you were to see an overrepresentation of certain things in the normal human population, maybe that would be protective from developing severe COVID-19. So that's having higher versus lower. It's those kind of differences that allow the genetic assessments of COVID disease risks. So through that kind of analysis, the researchers centered in on a region on chromosome 3 that was more prevalent or more commonly found in the people who were hospitalized by COVID-19, suggesting it is a risk factor for being hospitalized. Now, these authors, the two researchers, they have a background of studying Neanderthal DNA. The lead author, it was the lead of the Neanderthal Genome Project, so they obviously think about Neanderthal DNA quite a lot. And this region on chromosome 3 that they centered in on, they demonstrated to have been of Neanderthal origin. So all the kind of stuff I was talking about earlier in the video, how you can work out if DNA might have come from Neanderthals based on comparing genomic data, that's what they did. And they found that this risk region of about 50,000 bases of genetic information came from Neanderthals. And it seems to be a good risk marker for whether people develop severe COVID-19. Unfortunately, we aren't technologically at a state where someone can get a positive test for COVID and then have their genome sequenced in a flash and work out whether they're going to be on the tracks for severe case or not. That's somewhere we could go in the future, and this kind of information is really powerful to know if we could ever get ourselves into that kind of personalized medicine situation. But even still, knowing this kind of genetic information can be important and can be useful, because the researchers also demonstrated in this paper that there is geographical distribution of the Neanderthal variants of this part of chromosome 3. So obviously the normal humans, every human has the same region. It's just certain single nucleotide polymorphisms, certain SNPs that have come from Neanderthals, and it's those SNPs that are associated with disease severity. And those SNPs appear at different rates in different geographical areas. So for example, in South Asia, there is about 30% prevalence of the Neanderthal variations. However, in East Asia, there's very little of that, which is interesting that they're so split in a large area, but still South versus East. In European heritage populations, it's about 8% of people who have the risk variants, the Neanderthal variants. In admixed Americans, it's about 4%. So there is a big spread. And one population the authors focused in on were Bangladeshi people. So these have the highest prevalence of the Neanderthal variant. And interestingly, as the authors point out, in the UK, people of Bangladeshi origin have a twofold higher risk of dying from COVID-19. Now, as with many things in genetics, there's going to be a lot of confounding factors in that increased risk, that twofold higher risk. But there is this apparent genetic risk variant in that population. Now, the study didn't really go into what about that region of chromosome 3 might be driving the risk, which I found a little bit frustrating. I've since found a little bit of a hint that it might be to do with a part of the immune system known as complement. And I'm not going to go into that in detail because I haven't read the papers fully and checked things thoroughly. I'm focusing more on the Neanderthal link. But I found it interesting because I also read a very cool paper looking at post-mortem lungs from COVID people versus healthy dead people, so people who died not from COVID. And they found in that study that there was a lot of signatures of complement being high. So genetic changes to complement, high complement in people with COVID, there seems to be a cool link, and that's always nice to see in science when disparate studies all connect to each other around a certain theme. A hallmark of severe COVID is an uncontrolled immune response, and complement is a part of that. So it's looking like a very cool, interesting story, and one that's still being studied. And that takes me on to their second study. So I said how it's a bit frustrating that there was no real mechanistic detail of what about chromosome 3 was driving the risk of severe COVID-19. Well, in the second study, published in PNAS, again, linked down in the description, they did get some mechanistic detail, and it was very interesting. So through the same process, they compared hospitalized people with the wider population to look for differences in genetic signatures. And this time they focused in on a part of chromosome 12. And again, this has heritage from Neanderthals with Neanderthal variations, Neanderthal SNPs, which this time it appears that the Neanderthal variant is protective from severe COVID-19. So the 1,000 genomes population people, they had more of the Neanderthal variant compared to the people that were hospitalized. Now, what's cool about this region is we know the genes that are in it. So I say more mechanistic detail. And these genes are called OAS. So there's OAS 1, 2, and 3. And that stands for oligoadenylate synthase. Now, I've been going very long on this video, so what I'm going to do is break this up into 2 parts, and I'll publish the next part next week. So there's a plug to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, I guess. The reason I want to do that, though, it's not just for the YouTube metrics. It's that OAS is part of the interferon response, and this is something I'm very interested in. I did my PhD on some interferon-stimulated genes. So there's a lot I can talk about in this area, and a lot I'd like to talk about in this area. Just as the brief synopsis, the OAS genes are linked to protection against a lot of different viruses, and these Neanderthal variants have been associated with protection from West Nile virus, hepatitis C virus, and even a suggestion that they were protective against SARS-1, and now it seems they're also protecting against SARS-2. However, there seems to be an interesting evolutionary payoff about these OAS genes because many primates have lost the function of the OAS genes. They seem to have been positively selected for in Neanderthals to have them more active or to have certain variants, and they're more common in populations outside of sub-Saharan Africa. So there's a lot of things we can unpack there about people with more closely sub-Saharan African heritage and how they may be much more sensitive to severe COVID-19 because of the different variants of OAS. There's the evolutionary discussion around why some primates may have lost the function of it. There's the whole discussion of interferon. So there's a lot of things I want to talk about in that area, and I'm quite excited to talk about and have a change from vaccines. So that's what I'm going to talk about next week. The other reason that I want to break it up into 2 parts is that I've covered a lot of ground, I've talked about a lot of things, and hopefully I've done a good enough job that it's clear and everyone's been able to follow. But if not, this gives you a chance to leave some questions and comments down below that I can tackle through commenting on YouTube, or I can roll into the video next week to make this discussion all that better and more clear. So with that, I will say thank you for watching. If you found the video useful and interesting, as always, please drop a like for the YouTube metrics. Please leave the questions and comments, as I was just saying, so that I can roll them into the next video or help to clarify anything that I've not explained well enough to make it clear. And hit the subscribe button and the notification bell if you're new, so that you can come back for next week's video, which hopefully I will post at a similar time next Thursday. As always, like I say, thank you for watching. Please stay safe, wash your hands, wear a mask, and keep calm and carry on. We will get through this pandemic.